Hello everyone, and thanks for joining me for this week in Muscle Shoals Civil War history for the week of October 22nd to the 28th. October 26th through the 28th, 1864, battle at Decatur, ahead of General Hood's invasion of Tennessee. By October 1864, the war in the West was becoming increasingly dramatic as the Confederates struggled to regain the upper hand and stop the momentum of the Federal Army piercing the Confederate heartland in Georgia. Throughout the summer of 1864, Union Commander William Tecumseh Sherman had inched ever closer to the crucial railroad hub of Atlanta, while his Confederate opponents, first Joe Johnston and then John Bell Hood, were forced to yield more and more ground amid a terrible toll of bloodshed. On September 1st, 1864, the Confederates were forced to abandon Atlanta, and John Bell Hood turned his attention to harassing the long, cumbersome Union supply lines as a means of forcing the Union Army out of the city to settle the score on the battlefield. But Sherman was fed up with guarding every inch of railroad and had already become convinced that the best strategy was to abandon Atlanta altogether and strike out for the seacoast, subsisting on the local population to feed the army along the way. But before he could go forward with that plan, Hood's army had to be dealt with. Around the first week of October, alarm bells began to sound, as it appeared Hood may turn his attention to Tennessee by attacking Chattanooga. Federal forces mobilized to meet the threat, and Sherman closely pursued Hood's army for the time being. Throughout the first weeks of October 1864, it was not at all clear what Hood might do or where he might go. But Sherman had decided if Hood should go to Tennessee by way of the Shoals, he would simply let him go and turn his own attention to the march to the sea. Curiously, Sherman was eager for Hood to make the choice to invade Tennessee, as this would free him to make his move for the seacoast. He wrote on October 16th, quote, "I want the first positive fact that Hood contemplates an invasion of Tennessee. Invite him to do so. Send him a free pass in." End quote. Though, of course, Hood could not be permitted to prevail. Major General George H. Thomas was left as Sherman's second-in-command, with instructions to safeguard Tennessee in the event Hood should choose to invade. Finally, after weeks of uncertainty, Hood's forces began to move west and made their appearance at the Tennessee River. On the morning of October 26th, Union scouting parties led by Colonel Charles Doolittle of the 18th Michigan, who for many days had been carefully watching for signs of Hood's army, encountered a strong force of Confederates moving west on the Summerville Road. Federal forces had heavily fortified the perimeter of Decatur, and from these defensive works were able to check the progress of the Confederate force until nightfall imposed a ceasefire, as Colonel Doolittle described. Quote, "The fight continued until dark, the enemy being unable to drive us back an inch, notwithstanding he made several attempts to charge my line in his usual boisterous manner." End quote. After dark on the 26th, the commanding officer of the garrison, Brigadier General Robert Granger, arrived on the scene with instructions from General Thomas. Quote, "Do not allow yourself to be stampeded, but be prepared to contest to the death any attempt of the enemy to cross the river." End quote. Reinforcements continuously arrived throughout the night of the 26th and into the 27th, while Confederate numbers also swelled. Granger described the scene on the morning of the 27th, finding the Confederates massing at the front line. Quote, "The enemy received heavy accessions, and the morning showed us his line stretching from the river on the left across the Somerville and Moulton roads and covering nearly 2/3 of our entire front." End quote. The weather all throughout remained dismal, but Federal spirits remained optimistic, as Granger reported to Thomas on the 27th, quote, "The country is yet covered with a dense fog. We have everything well prepared, and the command is in excellent spirits, notwithstanding the torrent of rain last night, and I think I am safe in promising a fine result if the enemy attack." End quote. Light skirmishing throughout the 27th yielded no net change in position on either side. But then, early on the morning of the 28th, the pace of action intensified. At 3 a.m., the Confederates emerged from the dense fog, surprising the Federal pickets and driving them to the main fortification. The Confederates extended their entrenchments in a semicircle around the Union front, from one riverbank to the other. Thus, at daybreak on the 28th, the Federal garrison found itself surrounded in an incredibly vulnerable position, with Confederate guns trained all along their entire defensive front. As Granger described, quote, "It was evident immediately that it was absolutely necessary to dislodge the enemy from this position," end quote. Granger orchestrated a daring plan. On the Union right, a small detachment, led by Captain Moore of the 18th Michigan, with a number of the 102nd Ohio and 13th Wisconsin regiments, were ordered to covertly move, concealed by the riverbank, around the Confederate line, sneaking up behind them and charging in a surprise attack. The artillery would then fire on the Confederate lines from the front, with a supporting column moving on the line to take advantage of the confusion. The plan worked, and the Confederates retreated from their entrenchments and, according to Granger, quote, "inspired the garrison with great confidence," end quote. Meanwhile, on the Union left, the Confederates had established a menacing battery with a commanding line of fire on the river, including the Union pontoon bridge seen here in this photograph. Granger seized upon the moment and turned his attention to his other flank, as he here describes. Quote, "I immediately, upon the heels of the successful sortie upon our right, ordered Colonel Doolittle to send out the 14th U.S. Colored Infantry to charge this battery," end quote. Whereas only earlier in the year 1864, black servicemen were relegated almost exclusively to roles far away from combat and often considered unfit for actual battle by the racially biased white officer corps, here the African American Regiment, 14th USCI, was given the chance to fight. It was a frightful task before them. Colonel Thomas Morgan, commanding the regiment, said, quote, "They were cautioned that a battery was to be charged and taken if only 10 men survived to take it. They manifested no undue excitement or fear, but seemed anxious for the work," end quote. Supported by a crossfire of artillery from the northern bank of the river and from the Union gunboat Stone River, the 500 men of the 14th USCI overtook the Confederate battery, destroying 2 guns and taking 14 prisoners. Granger praised their performance in language common of the day. Quote, "The action of the colored troops under Colonel Morgan was everything that could be expected or desired of soldiers. They were cool, brave, and determined, and under the heaviest fire of the enemy exhibited no signs of confusion," end quote. The Confederates did retake the battery, but persistent barrage from gunboats and the Federal battery on the north bank of the river throughout the day made retaining the position costly. According to Granger, quote, "It was impossible for the men to withstand this attack. They deserted their guns, a portion of them retreating to their main line, while many of them rushed down the bank and sought the protection of the trees at the water's edge," end quote. During the day of the 28th, the Federal garrison at Decatur doubled from 2,500 to 5,000 troops, while the Confederate force, on the other hand, constituted nothing less than Hood's entire Army of Tennessee, estimated in the range of 35,000 to 39,000 men. Union losses amounted to 113 killed, wounded, and missing. At nightfall, the action came to a close, and a dense fog again rolled in. Though Granger could discern the Confederates were on the move, he didn't know their exact designs. Sherman, for one, had long since expected that Hood would attempt to cross the Tennessee River at the Shoals. The gallantry of the Union garrison had prevented Hood's crossing at Decatur, but Hood would not be stopped altogether so easily. If you found this interesting, I hope that you'll click the like button, subscribe to the channel to get your weekly dose of Muscle Shoals Civil War history, and if you're interested to dive deeper, you can check out my podcast, Historical Insights. I'll put a link in the description. Thanks for joining me, and have a wonderful week.